The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning. Welcome to today's training. This is Victoria Beal with the Ohio LTAP Center, and we are pleased to be hosting FTA Procurement Requirements Part 1 this morning. And we have Greg Harnett from RLS and Associates, who's going to be your presenter. We do have Dave Seach and Tim Maseko from ODOT, who are going to be in the background as panelists to answer any questions that might arise and assist with answers. So if everyone could please take a look at their GoToWebinar panel. There is a questions box there, and I'd like for you to drop me a hi or hello in that question box so I know you found it, because that's where we are going to ask that you please submit questions throughout the presentation training this morning. We want to make certain that everybody knows where that's at, and we are going to do our best to get those questions answered in real time. So please make sure you're submitting questions as they come up. Also, there are handouts in the handouts section of the GoToWebinar panel. And if for some reason you can't get those to download, in about 5 minutes, you're going to get an email from me with all those as attachments as well. So hopefully that'll take care of any download issues on anyone's computer. With that, I'm going to turn things over to Greg. Are you ready, Greg?
Absolutely fantastic. Thank you, Victoria. Hello, everyone. You're in the right place. We're here to talk about procurement today. My name is Greg Harnett. Just a quick introduction about myself. So I work for the firm RLS and Associates. We're actually right here in Ohio. I'm in Dayton, Ohio right now. I live in Centerville. So it's good to do some work locally here. Just a little background about myself. So I work almost completely in compliance. A lot of what I do is actually triennial reviews and state management reviews for FTA. But I also work with state DOTs throughout the country, really, providing technical assistance and occasionally helping those state DOTs exercise oversight of their subrecipients. So I bring this to you just to kind of let you know the lens from which I approach this topic. We're going to really be talking about those compliance touch points that FTA, is going to look at if you ever do find yourself maybe caught up in a state management review or some kind of other FTA-related audit or oversight activity. So right now I'm just going to go through our session coverage. As you might know, we kind of have two parts today. They'll both run about 2 hours. So our part one is really like Procurement 101. These are kind of the high-level things that I think everyone should know if they're involved in procurement. And then in the afternoon, we'll take a 1-hour lunch break. And then from 1 to 3, we'll kind of do our second part, which will be more like Procurement 201. We're kind of going to build on some of the concepts that I'll present this morning, and we'll go into slightly more advanced waters, some variations and more kind of complicated wrinkles in the FTA procurement. So for this first part, part one, here's our menu. First, I'm going to go through some procurement resources that I think everyone should know about. And then I'm going to hit on some new developments in procurement compliance. And then we're going to go through our 3 purchasing thresholds. So you've probably heard some of these terms before. We have micro purchases, then we'll have small purchases, also called simplified acquisitions. I'll explain that difference when we get to it. And then finally, formal purchases. So as you might know, the general rule is as you're spending more money, there are more requirements that we have to comply with. And then after we go through those 3 different purchasing thresholds, I'll talk about non-competitive procurements. That means things like sole source procurements, single bid procurements. We'll talk all about that. And then I want to hit on joint or piggyback procurements. We'll talk about how that differs a little from the traditional model, but how there are still a lot of requirements that you still need to be aware of. And then I want to talk specifically about rolling stock. When you're buying rolling stock, there are additional requirements that you wouldn't really see when you compare it to your typical off-the-shelf FTA-funded procurement. So we'll hit on all those. And then we'll talk about rolling stock disposition. And disposition is kind of like the opposite of procurement. If procurement is buying something, disposing of it means selling it, or there are a few other options we'll talk about. And then, because I mentioned that I'm an FTA reviewer, I'm going to finish up our morning session by going through some common procurement findings that stem from triennial and state management reviews. And, this is an area where there are actually some pretty easy steps you can take, I think, to avoid some of these common issues. So we'll talk through that. So we'll start with these procurement resources. The first thing I want to make you aware of is FTA Circular 4220.1F. And by the way, in the handouts, you should have a link to both the morning and afternoon presentation deck, and then also a Excel file that we'll talk about in a little bit. And that's kind of like ODOT's procurement checklist that subrecipients can use. And that's a fantastic resource. So we will spend a little bit of time on that. But you've probably seen these FTA circulars. I think there's about 15 of them now. They all cover a different topic. So the procurement one, its official name is third-party contracting, is 4220.1F, like I said. One thing I want to caution everyone about is this circular is a little out of date. It was last updated in March of 2013. So, I mean, we're in 2022 now. That's almost 10 years ago. And I keep hearing that a new revision is on deck, but I've been hearing that for a while and I haven't seen it yet. So don't hold your breath. But I want to let you know that it's a little stale just because if you go into that circular, specifically when we're looking at the thresholds and the dollar amounts that kind of bump you up into the, say, micro purchase to small purchase or small purchase to formal purchase threshold, those are going to be a little outdated in FTA circular. So just want to caution you about that. And you know, a nice trick, all the FTA circulars have a name kind of like 4220.1F. The last kind of digit there is a letter, and that refers to the revision number. So when there finally is a new FTA procurement circular, it'll be called 4220.1G. So that's a nice little trick. If you see 1G, you'll know it's the new one. That'll be a fun day when that finally comes out. So as you might know, the FTA circulars are kind of written in dense, almost legal language. So that's why item number 2 here, the best practices procurement manual, I think is really valuable. So this is another resource that is written by FTA. And what kind of sets this apart from the circular is it's written, I think, in clearer language, and there's more of a focus on not just the rules, but examples and explanations. And there are actually a number of appendices that have some great sample forms. And actually, we have a few of those throughout this presentation. So whenever I show one, I'll be sure to mention, by the way, this comes from the Best Practices Procurement Manual. But again, this one is a little outdated. It was last updated in October 2016, so it is also due for a revision. And that's why item number 3 here is kind of nice. So every year, FTA prepares what they call a contractor's manual. Now, previously, you might know this under a different name. It was called the Comprehensive Review Guide. So this is basically the FTA guidance that FTA provides to its reviewers who do triennials and state management. But it's not like a secret. They kind of write it for a broader audience, and they hope and expect that recipients and subrecipients will also look at this. But it's a very long document, and it seems to grow every year. But that's the key. It is updated every year. So unlike, for Circular 4221F or the Best Practices Procurement Manual, this will have all the up-to-date FTA guidance every year. The only year it wasn't updated was FY 2021, and that was due to the pandemic. But we have the FY 2022 FTA Contractors Manual. Now, it's not just about procurement. It actually covers now 23 potentially applicable topics that could come up during a state management or triennial review. Procurement is just one chapter in there, but it's the biggest one, and it's an important one. And what's really nice about this contractor's manual is, in addition to just kind of the questions that FTA reviewers may ask, there's really good explanation about exactly from where each question stems in terms of the requirement. It'll point you to the relevant FTA circular, or perhaps it will be something like 2 CFR 200, which we'll talk about next. So it'll tell you kind of where all of these questions come from in terms of like the regulatory basis. So that's what's really nice about the contractor's manual. And of course, it's updated every year. So the next item on our list, 2 CFR 200, you've probably heard of this. A lot of people call it the super circular. That's not the official name, but it's a cool name. I call it the super circular. A lot of people do. And it's called that because 2 CFR 200 is really written by OMB, the Office of Management and Budget. and it applies to all recipients of federal grants. So not just FTA grant recipients, but really 2 CFR 200 is kind of like the foundation from which a lot of these requirements stem. So that's why I have it here on our list. And then the last item we have is something called Procurement Pro. And this is actually a web-based tool that is developed by National LTAP. A lot of us have probably heard of that. And it's the type of thing where you just need to kind of sign up, a username and passwords, all you have to create. It's obviously free, and it's kind of a web-based portal that has some really nice procurement resources. And we'll get into that in a little more detail as we continue on here. But I just wanted to hit you right away with all these procurement resources. And these are kind of like the materials I used to develop this presentation. So, you know, these are the primary sources, and what I'm giving you is just kind of my own value added, hopefully, take on that. Great, so let's move right along now. We'll talk about some new developments in procurement compliance that I think everyone should know about. So first, we have some increases to the procurement thresholds. This happened back in June 2018. So this is why when I pointed out how the circular and the best practices procurement manual were updated before this date, they don't reflect these new procurement thresholds. So that's why I really want to drill this home. So as you can see, OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, they've raised the federal micro purchase limit from $3,500 all the way up to $10,000. And we'll talk exactly what a micro purchase means if you don't know yet. So just kind of put a pin in that, hold those thoughts. And then another thing that happened is the simplified acquisition threshold, or in other words, the small purchase limit. Anything above that simplified acquisition threshold has to be a formal purchase. That went from $150,000 all the way up to $250,000. So these were fairly major increases to these thresholds. And of course, if you're caught up in some kind of state management review or oversight review or audit, the auditors will, if they choose to review your procurement files, they'll review based on the thresholds that were in place at the time of purchase. So it's not like retroactively every single micro purchase is now, you know, you can treat that up to $10,000. It's what was in place at the time. But, you know, 2018 now was a couple of years ago. So really everything should be kind of reflecting these new thresholds. However, there's something very important to keep in mind. And that is these thresholds that I just talked about are really like the ceiling. They're the highest possible you could set these different thresholds. And it's actually allowable and frankly, quite common for me to see lower or more restrictive thresholds. And actually, if you're a subrecipient of Ohio DOT, you know, we actually do have lower thresholds. So the micro purchase limit is still $10,000, but it's important to note that the small purchase range is just $10,000 all the way up to $50,000. So it's a lot narrower than potentially it could be at the federal level. And that's because Ohio has a law on the books that basically says anything estimated to cost more than $50,000 has to be treated as a formal purchase. So we'll just keep that in mind, and I'll remind you as we move through this material. I'll make sure I'll say, you know, for folks in Ohio, keep in mind it's $50,000, not $250,000 as the simplified acquisition threshold. Now, some of you may have heard of Buy America, and we'll talk about it in more detail. And, you know, a common stumbling block I see in my work is a lot of people will assume because that simplified acquisition threshold increased from $150,000 up to $250,000, that the Buy America threshold would naturally follow suit. But actually, it has not increased to $250K. It's actually set by a separate statute. So when OMB increased those procurement thresholds at the federal level, it did not affect Buy America. So the Buy America requirements will still kick in at $150,000. All right, so let's jump right into the good stuff. We'll talk about micro purchases first. So a micro purchase is anything estimated to cost up to and including $10,000. And, you know, a micro purchase is pretty easy, but I don't want you to walk away with the impression that if it's a micro purchase, there really aren't any requirements in terms of your record keeping or the process you follow, because there actually are. But as we'll see, this is kind of the simplest type of FTA-funded procurement. So from FTA's perspective, the only documentation requirement for these micro purchases is a determination that the price you paid is fair and reasonable, and you also have to have a basis for that determination. So we'll break that down in a bit, but there are a few other bullets I want to cover on this slide. If you look at the second bullet here, this is kind of an aspiration, and this is the language FTA uses, to the extent practicable. So it's not a hard requirement, but they're saying if you can, recipients and subrecipients. So I will say throughout this presentation, I use the word recipients, but we can understand that to mean recipients and also subrecipients, because I believe many of you participating today are probably subrecipients, but we're going to use those words interchangeably. There's really not that much of a difference, just, in our presentation today. So to the extent practical, recipients or subrecipients should distribute their micro purchases equitably among qualified suppliers. So what this means is, as an example, if you are not, say, maintaining your vehicles in-house, maybe you're a small, more rural system, and what you do is you maybe have a few different dealerships in the area, and you'll go to them and they'll help you service your vehicles and do that preventive maintenance. So just kind of put yourself in those shoes. If there were multiple dealerships or shops in the area that could do that work, what this means is, if you can, all other things being equal, try to spread the work around a little and not just show favoritism to one vendor. Who knows, you might have a better experience at another one. They might offer slightly better prices. So that's just kind of an aspiration, again, to the extent practicable is the language FTA uses. And then our final bullet point on this slide, this is almost common sense, but it does have to be said. You can't divide or reduce the size of, say, a smaller formal purchase, so something bigger than a micro purchase, into like a series of micro purchases just to kind of avoid those additional requirements that would be applicable to the larger procurements. So as a just example for that, if you were, say, buying new office furniture and you kind of went through your estimate and you're like, wow, this is looking like it's going to cost more than $10,000. That's unfortunate. I was hoping it would be a micro purchase, so I didn't have to go out and get bids, and we'll talk about what a small purchase would look like. If you have a light bulb go off above your head and you think it's a bright idea to be like, wait a minute, instead of a small purchase, let's just buy half of it this week, half of it next week, and we have 2 micro purchases. That's obviously not going to fly. So you can't intentionally divide up a larger purchase into a series of smaller ones just to kind of sidestep the requirements that come with making those larger purchases.
Greg, we have a question.
Fantastic. Yeah.
Before I read that one off, I want to let John know that I will find Clayton's link and email it over to him. All right. The question is, IIJA/bill added construction materials to Buy America requirements. Is there any additional guidance on this?
Construction materials yeah, so we commonly see Buy America kind of triggered when 2 things happen. One is kind of a rolling stock procurement, and the other is very common is in construction. So technically Buy America, it applies to manufactured goods, and that's what rolling stock is, or anything involving steel. So steel is almost always a very common construction material. But, oh, sorry, one second. Don, I'm on a webinar. Yeah, so back to the question. If you wouldn't mind, Victoria, can you just kind of read that again just so I can make sure I'm answering it correctly?
IIJA/bill added construction materials to Buy America requirements. Is there any additional guidance on this?
Okay. Yeah, well, you know what? Why don't we kind of hold that, because we'll have like a series of slides on Buy America. So this might be a good one to just kind of maybe put a pin in until we get to that point, if that's okay. And I'll be sure to hit on it then.
That sounds great. And John, if you could please drop Clayton's email in the question box, because I'm not seeing him as registered. So I'll get him registered real quick and send him a link. Thanks. All yours, Greg.
Great, thank you. All right, so take a look at this. This is something I call a micro purchase stamp, because I first saw this on the face of a stamp, and I thought it was a really neat idea because you could just stamp this on a purchase order or a receipt, and it's kind of all the documentation you would need for a micro purchase in a nutshell. So remember, the big requirement is the price has to be fair and reasonable, and that can be based on a number of things. One of the common ones I see is if you just have personal knowledge of what you're buying. Say, for instance, you need to buy a new computer and you just kind of have a good sense of, what computers cost these days and what certain specs would put you at in terms of the price. All you'd have to do is check that box. Yeah, I know that this is a good price because I generally follow this stuff and I can say this is fair and reasonable. But if you don't have personal knowledge, there are other common options here, like a catalog or price list. If you just see what you're seeking to buy advertised somewhere and then the price you pay is about that, that's a pretty good indication that it's a fair and reasonable price. And there could be some kind of other way it's fair and reasonable, and you would just write that there. And then of course we see these final two check boxes. Remember, you have to at least make some effort if possible to distribute these types of micro purchases equitably. And of course, don't divide up a larger purchase intentionally into a series of micro purchases just to sidestep the requirements that come with that larger purchase. And then you would just sign your name and put the date. So pretty easy, right? And because the micro purchase threshold went from 3,500 all the way up to 10,000, this was a pretty big development. And frankly, I think it was good news for a lot of FTA recipients and subrecipients. I know with inflation, $10,000 is not what it used to be, but you can still buy quite a bit for that amount and under. And all you would have to do is make sure that you can visualize this micro purchase stamp, and that would kind of be your checklist for making these types of purchases. All right, so let's build on that. And let's jump up to the next level called small purchases. And I say AKA, also known as simplified acquisitions. And that is because I've noticed FTA in their language, they're still saying small purchases, but they're also using this new phrase, simplified acquisitions. And I kind of get it now, because remember, at the federal level, a small purchase is anything more than $10,000. Now all the way up to $250,000. It used to be 150, then it went up to 250. And so that's $250,000. It's kind of, it's hard to say that would be a small purchase, if you know what I mean. So now it's just also called a simplified acquisition. So I just don't want you to be thrown if you see it called that. Those two terms now are kind of interchangeable. All right, so small purchases, like I said, these are those procurements estimated to cost more than $10,000 all the way up to $250,000. However, remember that in Ohio, if you're a subrecipient of Ohio DOT, these small purchases are going to be more narrow. It'll be anything estimated to cost more than $10,000 but less than $50,000. So when you're making this small purchase, there are more things you need to keep in mind. So in a nutshell, this is when you have to actually obtain oral or written price quotations from what they call an adequate number of qualified sources. What that means is, at the bare minimum, at least 2, but ideally 3 or more. So unlike a micro purchase where you could just buy whatever you choose as long as you make sure that price is fair and reasonable, this is when you actually have to go and get several different options or price quotations. And then you would typically make the award to what is called the lowest responsive and responsible vendor. And I underlined both of those words because we'll define those on the next couple slides. So just keep those in mind. A few other requirements for micro purchases, and we'll have a slide on each one of these, so don't feel like you have to remember it all now. We'll break it down. But this is when you really have to maintain a procurement history. So in other words, some kind of like procurement file documentation that you maintain for, frankly, audit and review purposes. And what that procurement file looks like, there are certain required things that do have to be in there, and we'll touch on those. But in general, depending on the size and the complexity of what you're buying, that procurement file might be, just pretty thin, or it could be many, many volumes, depending on, if you were undertaking a sophisticated or complicated procurement. So we'll talk more about that. The next couple bullet points, I have underlined and in bold because these are especially important, and we'll have slides on these too, but I just want to make you aware of everything on this one kind of introductory small purchases slide. A very important thing is that there are certain FTA required contract clauses, that must be included, not just in the contract, but ideally the solicitation. And we'll talk about that in some detail. Another thing you have to keep in mind, it's called an ICE, an independent cost estimate. And this is something that you should develop before you receive any bids or proposals. We'll talk about why in a few slides. And then related to the ICE, the independent cost estimate, there's something else called either a cost or price analysis. It's different from the independent cost estimate. We'll explain why, but really one of the big things you can kind of use to keep those two concepts straight is the ICE must be done before you get any bids or proposals in, while the cost or price analysis has to be done after that point. So after you receive bids or proposals, but before you make the contract award. All right, so remember I used those words responsive and responsible. So let's kind of break down exactly what those are now. So this is really just the technical language. Responsive means that the bidder will conform in all material aspects to the requirements of the solicitation at the time of submission. So material means anything that would affect the substance of their bid, like price, quantity, quality, timeline. If it's just a minor typo, that would probably not be considered a material defect, and I don't think you would consider a bid or proposal non-responsive because of that. So it has to be material. And ideally, when you get a bid or proposal in, you'll do something called a responsiveness determination. So just as an example, and I know we haven't touched on all this yet, so if it doesn't all quite connect, don't worry, we'll get there. But say you put out a written solicitation, like an RFP, or request for proposals. And in that, you had maybe a format where all the proposals had to kind of be submitted in either electronically, a certain page number. Often, and we'll talk about this, there are certain certifications that these bidders or proposers have to, sign and submit along with their bid or proposal. So when you do your responsiveness determination, you'll want to make sure essentially that what you're getting back is exactly what you asked for in the format you asked for. If you're asking for pricing information, it really has to be apples to apples. And it's not common, but it does happen from time to time that you will get a bid or proposal back that just isn't really responsive. It doesn't reflect the solicitation, like the RFP that you put out. And if it's a material defect, then typically, if you found them non-responsive, then they would essentially be knocked out of the process and wouldn't go any further with that bid or proposal. In addition to being responsive, the bidder has to be responsible. And this means a few things, but I think the main idea, and this is probably what I would like you to take away from responsible, it means that you should check that website, sam.gov. A lot of people have heard of that. It's an acronym. It stands for System for Award Management. And basically, it's a database of all firms and I believe individuals now who are certified and eligible to do business with the federal government on any level. So even as a subrecipient of FTA monies from ODOT, that's still kind of considered the federal government. So you would want to check this website, sam.gov, and see that the vendor that you received a bid from, that they're listed on there and that they have no active exclusions, essentially meaning they haven't been blacklisted from doing business with the government. So check that sam.gov website, and that's the best way to ensure that you would be making an award to a responsible vendor. So responsive and responsible, we're going to use those terms a few more times. All right, so just kind of continuing on our checklist for small purchases. Remember, I was talking about those FTA required contract clauses. So there are specific clauses that have to be included in these FTA contracts, and it can be a little tricky because not every single clause will apply to every contract. And actually, the applicability is determined on a few things: the type of the procurement, and also the size, meaning dollar value of the procurement. So I have a table on the next slide that we'll break down. Okay, so don't strain your eyes trying to read every detail on here. I just kind of want to get the main point across. So in this left-hand pane, we can see just the name of each clause. And by the way, this goes on for a few pages, so keep that in mind. There are a number of clauses. Here's just the name of them. And then we have 5 different types of procurement. So there's professional services and also A&E, that means architectural and engineering procurement. We'll talk this afternoon in detail about those A&E procurements. They have to be done according to their own process that can look a little different from just kind of the basics that we're going to cover this morning. Second type of procurement is an operations or management subrecipient type award. So this is, for example, sometimes we'll see like a municipality, like a city, that'll really just be kind of a conduit for funding. So they won't actually operate the service themselves. They might have like a turnkey solution, an operations or management contractor like Transdev, First Transit. There are a number of them, and I'm sure we've heard names like that. So that type of procurement will have its own set of rules in terms of which clauses will become applicable. Moving on to the third of these 5 types of procurement, we have rolling stock, so purchasing vehicles basically. And then construction, I think that's self-explanatory. We're going to talk about that in detail this afternoon. And finally, material and supplies. So what we have here are the clauses on the left. We have 5 types of procurements. And you can see for many of these initial clauses, they need to be depending, if it's above that micro purchase limit, these clauses have to be in all the solicitations and the contracts that you issue. So things you've probably heard of, civil rights, that means EEO, Title VI, ADA. But then as we kind of get into some of these other clauses, like Buy America, we can see here, well, that would only apply to rolling stock, construction, and materials and supplies. Remember, it only is applicable if what you're purchasing is estimated to cost more than $150,000. So that's kind of why we see this here, greater than $150,000. So there's a lot here. Don't get too worried. It might seem like solving a Rubik's Cube in terms of knowing which of these clauses have to make it into the solicitation and the contract. But there is kind of a nice little shortcut that I can share with you. So I say here that the takeaway is there's a large number of these clauses. Determining their applicability can actually be complicated, but here's where something we talked about a few minutes ago comes into play. Remember that Procurement Pro developed by National LTAP. So here's the link to it. One thing Procurement Pro is really good at is actually generating those FTA required clauses. So essentially what you would do is you would kind of enter the estimated cost of the procurement as well as the type of procurement. And Procurement Pro will like kind of in a way go through that chart we just looked at for you and then spit out only those relevant clauses. So a really nice shortcut. So keep that in mind, Procurement Pro. Great, let's continue on. Now, as I was saying, they're called contract clauses, but don't let that name fool you because really FTA would expect to see these in the solicitation as well as the resulting contract. And the reason is, so if you put these contract clauses, usually you'll see them as like an appendix to the RFP or whatever solicitation you're using. And we'll talk about RFPs in much more detail. So if that's a new term to you, don't worry. It's good to have that in the solicitation because say you didn't have that there and you're like, oh, these are just contract clauses. So I'll wait until, we're ready to make the award and then we'll just make sure the contract has all these clauses. That could create a problem if your bidders or proposers weren't initially aware of these FTA required clauses. And it could lead to a situation where perhaps had they known, it may have changed their price or their ability to do the work. So that's why you really kind of need to have that in your solicitation so that it's understood from the very beginning as bidders and proposers are developing their budget and their price that, oh yeah, by the way, we have to play by all these rules I saw listed. And of course, the final bullet, I had to put this in here. As we'll see, this is actually a very common finding in triennial and state management reviews, so not having all of the required FTA contract clauses. But if you have them in your solicitation and in the resulting contract, then it's just very unlikely that reviewers or auditors will miss that, so they'll be sure to give you credit for it. All right, and we're just again continuing. Oh, go ahead.
Hey, this is Dave. I just wanted to mention something that we used in the past at ODOT. We used to put all the contract clauses in there. And it was found that FTA just wanted the specific contract clauses that apply to the type of procurement. And so I wouldn't want anybody to make that mistake and, just include everything in there. Because it is very specific to that. We were kind of called out on that at one time. Thanks.
Yeah, that's a great point, Dave. Yeah, so it would be tempting maybe to just like get a full set of these clauses and, just think, okay, so here they all are, and I'll just attach this to every type of contract or solicitation. But yeah, FTA can be quite picky, and in general, they want to see only the relevant clauses. They don't want to see clauses that wouldn't be applicable to a procurement of that type or at that dollar amount, because that would just kind of confuse things in terms of like your vendors might not know which clauses really apply. So great point there. Absolutely. So let's move on to the next item we had, which is the ICE, the independent cost estimate. So at a very high level, an ICE is your estimate of what an item or service, whatever you're seeking to buy, should cost. And of course, depending on what you're going to buy, that could be relatively simple, or it could be something that is complicated and would maybe require a lot of steps. So I just want to actually, I like this story, and someone else recently gave me a little punchline to make it even better. So I always describe an ICE kind of using this example. If I were traveling, for instance, and I was at an airport or in a new city, I would expect, okay, I want to buy a cup of coffee, and depending on where I am, like it might be a few dollars, maybe more than I'm used to paying. So if you're at an airport, who knows, coffee might be $3, $4, $5. So I would have that in mind. That would be my idea of what the coffee should cost. So say I walk up to the counter and ask for the coffee, and they'll say, no problem, that'll be $50. I'll be, wait a minute. So I thought it would be like $4 or $5, and they're telling me that it costs $50. Just that kind of thought process, and it's something we probably all do just subconsciously in our everyday purchases. That's really what an ICE is designed to do. So you'll have some idea of what it should cost. So then when the actual price comes in, you'll know, okay, so this is way more than I thought I was going to pay. Like something's wrong here. Maybe I'm not getting a good deal. Or it might cause you to maybe revisit your idea of what it should cost. Maybe I made some assumptions when I came up with that $4 or $5. So that's an ICE in a nutshell. And this is how you can remember it. What if I was buying an ICE coffee? How's that? Someone gave me that gem recently, so I promised I'd put it in this presentation. So some available data points for developing this independent cost estimate. Commonly, like a published price list would be one really nice data point that could feed into your idea of what something should cost. Another thing is any historic pricing information. So if you say a few years ago awarded a contract for something similar, what you paid then will probably give you, to some degree, a decent idea of what you could expect to pay now. You would probably have to make some adjustments for, availability, inflation, things like that. But, that's a good data point that can feed into your ICE. Another really nice thing is if you know another agency that you talk with frequently, maybe you'll call it a sister agency. If you know they bought something similar recently and you're now seeking to buy something like that, just kind of, if you have this kind of relationship with them, if you're able to ask, hey, by the way, I know you bought these, we'll say, annunciators for your vehicles that call out the stops automatically. Like, how much do you pay for that? Just so we know. That kind of insight can be really valuable as you're developing your ICE. And of course, depending on what you're buying, if this is something very complicated, like say a rolling stock procurement, or if you're trying to design and build a new facility and there's some really technical knowledge that would have to go into even coming up with that initial idea of how much you might pay, that's when you might have like an independent third party who has that expertise come in and help you develop your ICE. But when we say independent, I don't want you to walk away with the impression that independent means it has to be done by someone outside your organization. It typically does not, unless it's one of those very specialized, complicated types of procurements. Independent really means that your idea of what something should cost comes from you, and we have that right here. The word independent doesn't mean it.
I'm sorry to interrupt. We have a question that came in. They would like to know if we are purchasing vehicles through Ohio's cooperative purchasing program, can we assume that some of these steps have already been completed?
That's a great question. When we get to rolling stock, we can hit on this even more. So in a word, I would say you cannot assume. Now, if you're buying off an Ohio DOT sponsored state contract, odds are, it was procured and awarded according to all these rules that we're covering today. But it actually is pretty important. I ran into this in the last triennial I did actually earlier this week. Subrecipients, if you're buying off a state contract or some kind of joint procurement, you really do need to take those steps and confirm that the underlying procurement was solicited and awarded according to all these requirements, that the ICE was done. Odds are all the heavy lifting has been done for you, and that's why purchasing off a state contract can be really attractive. But you can't just make that blanket assumption every time. You should make sure that, okay, I do know that when this original RFP went out, there were those contract clauses there. And when it comes to rolling stock, you might know that there are a number of things like, you've probably heard of the Altoona bus testing certificate. You probably know about the, pre and post award Buy America certification. So there are things like that that you would want to make sure you're maintaining on your own. You can't just rely on the organization that did the underlying solicitation. Because as an example, I did a triennial review this week where there was a transit system who, there were some new people. This procurement was done not on their watch, but they didn't really have access to the files that I would expect them to see. We were able to track it down, but we had to explain that, when you're buying even off a state contract, you really need to have all of the paperwork independently so you can verify, for instance, that an ICE was performed. So that's the long answer. I think in a nutshell, if you're buying off an ODOT or state contract, odds are everything has been taken care of for you, but you can't just always assume that. You should take some steps to, just confirm that. And then in the context of rolling stock, make sure you have things like the post-award Buy America certification, the Altoona bus testing certificate, because those are things that auditors will ask to see. Does that answer the question?
That's all the questions I have on here for right now. Thanks.
Hey, Greg, this is Dave again, and I'd just like to add that, we do follow all these requirements. When somebody is one of our transit systems, for instance, wants this information, they usually send me an email asking for it. We have the pre-award audit. We have all the things that are required as part of the procurement requirements on file. So we would send that to them. And we were reviewed on our procurement of vehicles in 2019. We had a procurement review by FTA, and that we were found compliant with our contracts, so our vehicle term contracts. So, I agree, each of the systems or anyone that's buying our state term contract should want to, they need that information in case when there is a review. And so I believe that we're pretty well qualified for that. Thanks.
Thanks, Dave. Absolutely. Yeah. So you can be relatively confident that ODOT has done the heavy lifting for you. But again, you would just want to make sure. And say if you were buying off a state contract that wasn't procured by Ohio DOT, that's when you really want to make sure that all those FTA specific things have been hit on. But yeah, great point, Dave. I remember that PSR, and I'm really proud of how ODOT did. So that's wonderful.
Thanks.
So the second bullet point here, and I know we've kind of talked about this, but I really want to hammer this home. The ICE must be conducted prior to the receipt of bids or proposals. That's what it means when we're saying this is an independent cost estimate. Because going back to the coffee example, say I somehow had no idea what coffee should cost, and I didn't kind of have that idea before I walked up to the counter at the cafe, this will be maybe $4 or $5, and they just told me, yeah, coffee, that'll be $50. I might just be like, gee, I guess that's what it costs these days. Here's 50. So the ICE has to happen before you actually see any pricing information in bids or proposals, because if you saw that stuff first, that might color your perception of how much something should cost. So really, that's what we mean when we say independent. We don't mean that it has to be prepared by someone outside your organization, just independent from any pricing information that will come in through those bids or proposals. So what we have on this slide is just a sample ICE form, and this actually comes from that best practices procurement manual that I was talking about earlier. So this, depending on what you're buying, this just might be your ICE, or if it's something very technical, this would be kind of like maybe the cover sheet to a packet that would have more supporting documentation. But in general, we can see here on this checklist things we talked about. So these are the data points that you might use for coming up with your independent cost estimate. Maybe you saw the published price, maybe you purchased something similar in the past, historic pricing, comparable purchases by other agencies, or again, if it's one of those really sophisticated procurements like we'll talk about this afternoon, maybe you're seeking to design and build a new facility, that's when you might have some kind of engineering or technical support here, and you would attach an estimate from a third party as a data point to your ICE. But if you have in-house capacity and expertise to estimate what these purchases should cost, you can do that in-house. Remember, independent doesn't mean someone else has to do it. So again, that's a form that comes from that best practices procurement manual. This is the type of resource that it is. It has a lot of examples and sample forms that I think are quite good. All right, so continuing on, we just talked about the ICE, the independent cost estimate. Now let's talk about really two different things, but they have a similar name. This can be a little confusing. Now we're talking about the cost or price analysis. And basically what this is, the cost or price analysis, it makes sure that you're not paying unreasonably high prices to your third-party contractors or vendors. What sets the cost or price analysis and distinguishes it from the ICE is when you do it. Remember, the ICE has to be done before you get any pricing information from bids or proposals. The cost or price analysis must be performed after you get those bids or proposals, but of course, before you award the contract. And whenever you see this topic discussed in FTA guidance, you almost always see it kind of written like this: cost/price, or it'll be cost and price. But really what it should be is cost or price, because they're two different things. And for any one procurement, you'll never do both. You'll do either a price analysis or a cost analysis. So let me break that down in the next slide. I think more commonly what you're going to do is a price analysis. And this frankly is fairly easy to do. If you say get 3 responsible bids back, and all other things being equal, say you got a bid back, one said it would be $30,000, one had $35,000, and one was $40,000. And it's just the same kind of off-the-shelf component that you're buying. You would obviously want to go with the one that costs the least amount, $30,000, assuming they're responsive and responsible. So that's a price analysis, basically. When you have price competition like that, you have multiple bids, offers, or proposals coming in, and you kind of circle the lowest one because you have price competition, assuming all other things are equal. That's a price analysis. It's kind of like done for you. I mean, you would want to document it, obviously, but just kind of putting those prices next to each other and circling the lowest one is how you can think of a price analysis. Now, a cost analysis is a little bit more tricky, and you would only have to do this in situations where competition is inadequate, so you don't have price competition. An example, and we'll talk about this in more detail in a bit, is a sole source procurement. That's when you know in advance that what you're seeking to buy is only available from one source. So if you go through with the sole source procurement, you're not going to have multiple prices come back. You'll just get the one. So you don't have the ability to kind of compare that bid to the other the others, you have to do a cost analysis. A price analysis is not possible. So a cost analysis is really just kind of like a double click on the cost that you're provided, and you just want to establish that it's reasonable. Now, an easy way to do this is see if you can compare it back to your ICE, your independent cost estimate. And if it's in that rough range, that's very strong evidence that it's a reasonable price. Sometimes you can't always do that, or the way the pricing works, it's more complicated. However, sometimes you might ask in your solicitation for the pricing information to be submitted in a certain way. And I'll give an example that I'm just very familiar with because I do a lot of work as a consultant. Sometimes when I'm preparing proposals, they will ask for kind of like our fully loaded rate, our labor rates broken down. So they would have kind of like the base salary, and then they would have the overhead. And that's established like with our firm RLS. Every year we have to go through an audit, and that would assign our overhead rate. For most like consulting firms, it starts at about 100% and can go way up from there depending on how fancy the firm is. It could be a law firm, it could be like a 200% overhead, but it'll probably be closer to 100%, I think, in our industry. So you kind of take those two components, like the base labor, that's basically everyone's salaries. The overhead is like insurance, office space, keeping the lights on. And then on top of that, usually you're allowed to charge a reasonable profit, which might just be a few percent on top of that. So kind of breaking down that hourly rate into those different price components is really what a cost analysis can be. So if you're in one of those situations where you're able to actually determine how much profit the vendor is making, that's something you should include in your cost analysis, because you can essentially make sure that if it's one of those sole source or single bid procurements, that the vendor isn't taking advantage of the situation by maybe putting their thumb on the price a little because they know they're the only shop in town who can do this. So that's what a cost analysis is. When you don't have price competition, they want you to take kind of a second look at the price, make sure it's reasonable, maybe compare it to the ICE, see if you can break down the different cost elements and make sure that they're not charging like obscene profit margins on you. Great. So we talked about micro purchases, small purchases. Now we're going to dip our toes into those formal purchases. I just want to check, are there any questions at this point before we hit this topic?
There are no further questions currently, but everyone is welcome to put any questions they have in the question box at any time. Thanks.
Fantastic. Great. So formal purchases. And remember, for Ohio DOT subrecipients, your micro purchases, that's anything estimated to cost $10,000 or less. The small purchases are simplified acquisitions. For us in Ohio, this is kind of a narrow range. It'll go from anything above $10,000 to $50,000. And then $50,000 and up, we treat as a formal purchase in Ohio. But if you were in another state and you had the ability to take advantage of those kind of federal level thresholds, of course, we know that these days the formal purchase or simplified acquisition limit or threshold is all the way up at $250,000. So quite a bit of variation there depending on where you are. So this basically says what I just said. Formal purchases above $250,000 from the federal perspective, but in Ohio, because of a law we have, that means that anything estimated to cost $50,000 or above should be treated as a formal purchase. And unlike a small purchase where you can just get bids or quotes back, this formal purchase bracket, it typically involves like actually putting out a real solicitation that quite a bit of work goes into. If you've ever done one of these RFPs, requests for proposals, or a similar kind of procurement vehicle is the IFB, the invitation for bid. I'll break down what the difference is between both of those. I think it's on the next slide. But when you're making a formal purchase, really everything we just talked about regarding the small purchases will also apply. So formal purchase, you'll have to do that independent cost estimate. You'll have to do the cost or price analysis. Of course, want to make sure those applicable FTA contract clauses are in there. But there's some additional things that we didn't quite hit on when we talked about small purchases. For a formal purchase, this is when you absolutely need to have what FTA calls a written procurement history. So basically your procurement file. It can be a hard paper copy file or electronically, but you do have to have all of this information. And the FTA guidance says the following elements need to be part of your written procurement history. And they give these 4 bullet points. It's a little kind of vague when you just read that. So that's why I have some examples here. So I'll break these down. So your procurement file, it has to have the rationale for the method of procurement. So if it's a formal purchase, did you use an invitation for bid? Did you use a request for proposals? Again, we'll talk about exactly what those are. You also have to have some kind of evidence of the contract type. Is this like a fixed price contract, or is it more of a cost reimbursement model? So you would have that information absolutely needs to be in your procurement history. Third bullet point, the contractor selection or rejection. So say you got in 3 bids or proposals. In your procurement history, it should be very clear why you chose one as the winner and why the other ones did not get the award. So remember, we talked about the responsiveness determination as soon as you get bids or proposals in. So if perhaps you got 3 bids back, 1 was not responsive, then you would want to have that responsiveness checklist in your procurement file showing that, hey, bid number 3, we didn't go any further with, they were non-responsive. Or, say you go through your responsiveness determination, everything looks good, but then you do your responsibility determination. Remember, you would check that website, sam.gov, and say 1 out of the 3 bids you got back, the vendor either didn't show up on that website, or they showed up, and this would be bad, with something called an active exclusion, meaning, again, they are essentially blacklisted from doing business with the government. You'd have to do something bad to get on that list, but it could happen. So you cannot make an award to a vendor that is not responsible. And then, of course, if you're doing the RFP method, we'll talk about that in a bit, you would want to have some documentation that really shows how you evaluated these technical proposals and how you assigned scores based on the criteria. So we'll break that down in a bit. And then the final element here, the basis for the contract price. So that really means things we just talked about. You would want to have the independent cost estimate there. You'd want to have your cost or price analysis. So all these things have to be part of your procurement history. And this will probably come into play again if you have some kind of oversight review, or as an Ohio DOT subrecipient, when Ohio DOT gets their state management review, oftentimes the FTA reviewers are instructed to also look at the compliance of ODOT subrecipients, because you've probably heard this, but essentially ODOT stands in the shoes of its subrecipients when it comes to their compliance. So if that's kind of why we do these compliance reviews and webinars like this, if there's a problem on the subrecipient level, it could eventually reflect poorly on ODOT if they have a review. So it's all kind of on the table here. Then, of course, your procurement history, I think I mentioned this before. I mean, it might be a very thick file, multiple volumes. I've seen that before. But if you're buying something relatively simple, it just maybe wouldn't have all that paperwork in there. You want to make sure it has the required things. But you might see some really thick procurement files. You might see some more skinny ones. All right, so here it is. We talked about RFPs and IFBs. I've noticed a lot of people in our industry kind of use the term RFP generically. Like they'll call every solicitation an RFP because it's easy. I think that's the most common one. That's the phrase a lot of people know. But I've seen people call it an RFP even when it's an IFB, and there is a difference here. So the request for proposals, RFP method. So this is when you put out your solicitation. Hopefully you're going to get proposals back from, remember, an adequate number of qualified sources. You're going to make the award to, again, the responsive and responsible proposer whose offer is the best value or represents kind of the most advantageous offer to you, the subrecipient. And you can consider not just price, but other factors. So in your RFP, the requirement is you have to list out exactly how you're going to evaluate the proposals or the submissions that come back in. And oftentimes you'll see actually kind of like a rubric or a chart that explains exactly how each criteria will be weighted. Maybe there's 100 points total. It'll tell you, just as an example, price is 25 points. Your approach to the project might be 20 points. The firm's qualifications 20 points, and so on. You don't actually have to have the exact weighting there, but FTA does require that your RFP, your solicitation, at least lists in the order of importance the different factors that will be used to evaluate the proposals. The big difference between the RFP and the IFB is an invitation for bid. You're just kind of going with the lowest price. It doesn't allow you to potentially maybe pay a little bit more for a higher quality service or product. With the IFB, you'll put out your solicitation and you have to award to the lowest responsible proposer. So these are really just two different tools. It's not like one option is easier or better than the other. It depends on what you're buying. There might be a number of things where it's like, hey, an IFB, I know exactly what type of thing we need to buy. There's not a lot of like flexibility or room for like, an innovative approach here. That's when an IFB would be what you want to use. An RFP would be like, okay, money's important. Obviously, you probably have a budget for something, but say you're hiring consultants and you're like, we need a good team in here, not necessarily just the lowest cost team. We need to make sure that, they're going to do the work well. And because of that, we might go through our evaluation of the proposals, and it could be that the one that's the highest rated is not necessarily the lowest price. So that's the difference between RFP and IFB. One's best value, and one is just kind of the low bid. All right, let's keep moving on, and we'll talk about non-competitive procurements. So I should say that whenever an FTA reviewer sees a non-competitive procurement like a single bid situation or a sole source procurement, it does kind of represent a red flag, not because it's automatically a problem, but because these are kind of situations in which you have to do a little bit more than you normally would in terms of your analysis and documentation. Like there are certain things that have to be in the file for you to go ahead and make the award in one of these situations. And you've probably heard me mention a few times now, sole source and single bid. It's almost like cost and price analysis. I often see these two things kind of lumped together in the same sentence, but they're two different things. So we'll break it down. First, we'll talk about the sole source. So a sole source is only available in limited circumstances where what you're seeking to buy is truly only available from one source. And you can see these bullet points. This is right from the FTA guidance. So you would need to be able to hang your hat on one of these bullet points. So a good example, you see I put in bold and underline those first two bullet points. This is where I most commonly see it. I see a lot of sole sources when folks are buying software or perhaps additional functionality to maybe a software suite they already have. So just as an example, say you have a route match and you're using that as your scheduling and dispatch software. And of course, these days, everything is like software as a service. You're probably paying a monthly fee. Maybe there was also kind of an initial like setup fee, but in general, if you want those programs to do more, they probably can, and they'd be happy to sell you that functionality, you know what I mean? So if you have Route Match and you want it to have, just as an example, like real-time GPS tracking, you can't really turn to one of Route Match's competitors like Ecolane and be like, can you Ecolane add to my Route Match like this additional functionality? No, you're kind of locked into that ecosystem, right? Another probably simpler example would be if you have an iPhone and you want to download a new app, the only way, at least I know how to do it, is go to the Apple App Store. And that's, of course, by design. They want to take a cut of every transaction on their platform and their ecosystem. But that would be a sole source. It's only available from one place. So this is kind of something you would probably know in advance of you making the procurement that it's a sole source. And typically, again, you see this a lot in software, or if there are kind of compatibility issues or certain things that are proprietary or patented. So that's why I've highlighted the first two bullets. I don't want you to put too much value on the last two that I haven't highlighted, because if you just read this, it kind of gives the impression that the sole source is available in maybe broader situations than it is, because look at this. Award to another contractor would result in substantial duplication of costs that you wouldn't be able to recover through competition. You could probably say that in a lot of situations, and I don't know that it would justify a sole source in many of them. Similarly, that last bullet, if you award to another contractor and don't do a sole source, that would result in unacceptable delays in fulfilling your needs. Well, as you probably know, if you've ever had to prepare one of these RFPs, it takes a long time just to prepare it, and then you have to, publicize it, give proposers adequate time to put together their response, and you'll evaluate. Like, this timeline will take months and months. So I don't want you to think that, we can skip that long process, because that's an unacceptable delay to me. I need this stuff now. That typically, I don't think, would rise to the level of justifying a sole source. Again, I always see this with software and where there are kind of compatibility issues. Now, in order to do this type of procurement, a sole source, you have to have a written justification that explains exactly why what you're seeking to buy is only available from that single source. So like I said, you'd want to hang your hat on one of those first two pegs if possible. And this written sole source justification has to be part of your procurement file. If it's not there, I can tell you in an FTA audit, that's typically a finding. And that's why, whenever we ask for a list of FTA-funded procurements from an organization that we're going to be reviewing, and we select from that list maybe a few files that we'll actually want to do a deep dive on, we're instructed that if you see some sole sources or single bid situations, make sure that's kind of part of the basket of the procurements that you review, because we would really want to confirm that there was a written justification for making the sole source award. And then, of course, if it's a sole source or a single bid, which we'll get to, you cannot do a price analysis, because remember, there's no price competition. If it's only available from one source, or if you only get one bid back, we'll talk about that in a bit, there's no price competition. You have to do that cost analysis instead. And you might, again, link it back to your ICE. You might see if you can break down the different cost elements just to make sure that, there's not obscene profit being made off of that transaction. All right, and now let's talk about single bid. And I can say this used to be kind of an obscure topic up until maybe 2 years ago. The single bid was kind of like a footnote to sole source. You didn't see it much. But I can tell you these days, just in doing the reviews that I'm doing this year and working with various clients, I hear from almost everyone. They'll tell me that we used to put out RFPs and get multiple responses back. But these days, it can be more common that you put something out, maybe you just get one bid or proposal back. And, it's not great, but it's also not necessarily game over. So if you are in one of these positions, you were hoping that you'd get multiple bids or proposals back, the deadline arrives and you only have one. It's not game over, but what you would have to do, it's kind of like a sole source justification. You'd have to have a written kind of memo to the file explaining that competition was adequate, meaning, in a nutshell, you didn't do anything that caused the result of getting this single bid or proposal back. So an example would be like if you wrote a scope of work that was just so specific, it artificially narrowed the field, and maybe there really was only kind of one operation that could give you this super specific thing you're asking for, that might count against you. Or if the solicitation, like the RFP, you didn't adequately disseminate it. What if it, it's just something you put on your website in a little corner that, nobody knows to click on. It was only up there for like a day, and then you wanted your proposals back the next day. It's not enough time. We wouldn't probably consider that adequate in terms of its dissemination. So if you get a single bid back, you just need to take a look at your own procurement process and make sure that you didn't do anything to cause the result. And something that FTA really likes to see, and it's very strong evidence that it wasn't your fault, is if you only get one bid back and you were expecting maybe three, and you had maybe two firms in mind that you were hoping would submit their bids and they just didn't. What you can do, and it can be a very short email, just a few sentences. If you reach out to those firms that kind of passed on submitting a bid or proposal, and you just ask them why, if they give you any legitimate business reason, like, oh, we saw that, but we're all really busy now, we don't have capacity, or we saw your RFP and we just made the decision, we don't really have that type of expertise, so that's why we passed. Any legitimate reason like that is strong evidence that a deficiency in your procurement process did not cause a single bid. These are just kind of private sector forces that are out of your control. So if you have any correspondence like that, basically if an FTA reviewer sees that, they'll be very happy, and that'll really weigh towards you being able to make the award to the single bid that did come in. And if I just read this second bullet, I think it explains it maybe better than what I just said, so I'll read that. If the reason for receiving that single bid is out of the subrecipient's control, then you can say, all right, competition was adequate, and you can make the award. But remember, the price has to be reasonable in light of the cost analysis. Like a sole source, you can't do price analysis. There's no price competition. So you have to take a hard look at the price you're getting and maybe link it back to your ICE, see if you can see how much profit they're making. Just make sure that's a reasonable price because we don't have any competition. All right, as we continue on, let's talk about joint and piggyback procurements. Just pausing for some water, sorry about that. Okay, joint procurement. We see the word piggyback a lot, and it's almost like what I was saying with RFP. The term is just used generically a lot. Piggyback actually does mean something very specific to FTA, but a lot of what we think we mean when we say piggyback is actually a joint procurement. We're actually describing this. So I'll talk about joint procurements first, and then on top of that, we'll just talk about exactly what a piggyback means and how that's different. So a joint procurement, it sounds a lot like the name. It's when two or more purchasers agree kind of from the outset that they're going to use a single solicitation and enter into a single contract. So maybe you and another nearby transit agency, you both recognize that you need to buy something, and it's like, hey, why don't we not duplicate the effort here? Why don't we just put out one RFP together and we'll buy what we both need? Maybe you'll even get a better price that way with some kind of volume discount. And there'll be a single contract, and we'll both, take advantage of that. That's a joint procurement. And it is a little different from like a state contract, which is, as we were discussing, probably how many of the ODOT subrecipients are buying rolling stock. It's different from that because a joint procurement is really limited to just those two or more parties that put out the solicitation. So unlike a state contract where ODOT would, have vehicles available to its subrecipients, and it's kind of like an open-ended contract. There are some limitations, but in general, anyone who's in the position can kind of buy off that state contract. The joint procurement is different because you can't have like additional purchasers that subsequently, after the solicitation and the award, come along and they're like, oh yeah, I want to buy off that too. The joint procurement is limited to just those original parties that are contemplated and listed in the original solicitation. So no one afterwards can come along and just scoop up things from that contract. So that's a joint procurement. We often call it a piggyback, but it's important sometimes to get these phrases right, because if you are ever part of a review, it probably won't count against you if you say piggyback when you mean joint procurement. I wouldn't have a problem with that, but when people do use the right language, it makes reviewers go, oh, okay, so they really know what they're talking about here. It establishes credibility, So a piggyback is just this. If there is somebody like an FTA recipient who puts out an RFP and say they want to buy 100 widgets, just as like an example, something generic. And, it's actually a situation where due to maybe an honest mistake, maybe you didn't need 100, only 75, or maybe at some point you needed 100, but things have changed and you only need 50 now. So FTA is saying in those narrow circumstances where somebody makes an honest, good faith mistake or something has changed and they wind up with more than what they need, for reasons of economy, FTA is saying, all right, so you only need 75 of those widgets. We're not going to force you to keep the other 25 in a warehouse rotting away somewhere. If there's another FTA recipient who needs them, they can buy them, just for reasons of economy. But that's all it means. It's not a piggyback is limited to just that. And of course, if you intentionally procure more than you need, excessive quantities, that's a violation of the federal rules. So it's not a bright idea if you're like, I only need 50 widgets, but I'm really good at writing these RFPs. I know a lot of other people need them too. So I'll buy 200 and we'll take our 50, the other 150 are up for grabs and everyone's gonna love me because I did the procurement for them. It doesn't work that way, unfortunately. Okay, before we turn our attention to rolling stock, any questions we need to catch up with or comments in the chat?
None that I have. Thank you.
Great. So let's continue on to rolling stock. Now, when you're buying rolling stock, you have to play by really all the rules we just mentioned. And these days, a rolling stock procurement is almost certainly going to be a formal purchase, especially in Ohio. Everything above 50,000 is, and with the price of even used vehicles will probably be firmly in that category, right? So when you're making a rolling stock procurement, there are additional requirements you have to be aware of. So one of the big things is there are these pre-award and post-delivery audits. So there are certifications at the pre-award stage. So these are really the things that if ODOT put out an RFP, it was like maybe a ODOT-led state contract that they want their subrecipients to buy off of. ODOT would make sure that all the vendors with their offers would, fill out the certifications that were required in the solicitation. So the pre-award Buy America is just kind of like a promise from the vehicle vendor that, yeah, we know about Buy America and we're going to comply with it, similar to purchasers' requirements. But then at the post-award stage, that's when Buy America comes back into play. And you wouldn't need just a general promise like at the pre-award. The post-award Buy America certification is actually a listing of all the components that go into the vehicle. And really these days you have to make sure that 70% of those components are made domestically. And one thing to keep in mind about Buy America is that percentage has gone up in the last few years. Wasn't that long ago, it was 60%, and then there was this phased increase. It went to 65%, and now it's 70% domestic content is required for rolling stock to be considered compliant with the Buy America requirements. There's some other certifications at the post-award stage. Again, purchasers' requirements. This means that the vehicle you get is exactly what you need and what you wanted. And then we won't go into too much detail, but FMVSS, Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards. So these are all additional items of documentation you would want to maintain in your procurement file. Another thing, so we're just kind of continuing on with that idea, is this Altoona bus testing report. And it actually is named after Altoona, Pennsylvania. Somebody recently gave me the backstory here. There was a congressperson, this was their district, and they were able to kind of lobby to get this requirement, as jobs in their district. They would have a testing facility and make sure that all new, transit vehicle models are tested here, and the model has to have one of these Altoona testing reports before you accept the first vehicle. So you've probably heard of those Altoona reports. That's what it is. And then something else to keep in mind here. It's kind of a newer requirement, and this one's a little funky because if you look at the link, it's SurveyMonkey. If you've heard of SurveyMonkey, it's almost like social media. Like anyone can make a survey and like send it out to their friends. But FTA is actually using this. This is their official way to collect some information about rolling stock awards. So the requirement is within 30 days of making an award for rolling stock, you have to click on this link here, and it's only a couple questions. You basically enter the name of the bidder, the total dollar value of the contract, and make sure that it's an eligible TVM, that means transit vehicle manufacturer. That kind of implicates DBE goal methodology, disadvantaged business enterprise. So that's a whole other world we won't get into today, but these are the reasons why you have to report your rolling stock purchases using the SurveyMonkey link. And I know these days with increased focus on cybersecurity and like phishing schemes, it can seem a little strange. Like, is this really FTA reaching out to me, wanting me to enter this info using SurveyMonkey? But it's real. So don't be thrown if you see that. Great, moving right along. Let's talk about disposition of FTA-funded vehicles. So remember, we talked about buying them. Another very important related topic is, what do you do when it's time to get rid of a vehicle? Maybe it's reached the end of its useful life, or perhaps it's just not serviceable anymore due to damage or neglect. So we'll break this down. So really the big question here when you're seeking to dispose of an FTA-funded vehicle is, has the vehicle met its useful life? And I think on the next slide, I'll have a chart that explains exactly what that means. It comes from one of the FTA circulars. But in general, these FTA disposition requirements, they apply to both vehicles that have and have not met their useful life, but it's a lot easier to dispose of a vehicle once it has actually reached the end of its useful life. However, there is something to keep in mind. So these days, FTA is taking a slightly different approach to this requirement, and they say, for example, if you have a transit vehicle that has reached its useful life, you're disposing of it. A common way to do it is it's sold at an auction. If the vehicle brings in more than $5,000 per unit, which actually can be very common these days, again, with the prices increasing and even used vehicles, FTA draws a line there, and they're like, okay, we're at 5,000 or above, so we're talking some money. And then they'll kind of say, remember when you first bought that vehicle and FTA gave you 80% of the purchase price? That's the typical capital match ratio, 80% federal, 20% is your local match. So they'll say, this vehicle brought in more than 5,000, so every dollar above that $5,000 line, we want to be reimbursed for our participation in the original purchase price. We'll talk on the next slide about, well, the slide after this about how that works. Here's the useful life though. So this comes from FTA Circular 5010.1e, and the general idea here is that your larger, heavier duty vehicles are assumed to last longer. So if you have a 35 or 40 foot heavy duty or articulated bus, FTA says you should look to get about 12 years or 500,000 miles out of that. And note that the useful life is always years or miles. We'll talk about that in a bit, why that's significant. Going on down to slightly smaller vehicles, if you have a 30-foot heavy-duty transit bus, FTA is saying, okay, 10 years or 350,000 miles. If it's just body on chassis cutaway, a light-duty bus, maybe 25 feet, FTA is saying, okay, 5 years or 150,000 miles. Or maybe you have like support vehicles like a sedan, a van, an F-150. FTA is saying 4 years or 100,000 miles would be the service life of that vehicle. So I do actually think these useful lives are kind of generous. I bet a lot of us, like, our personal vehicles are more than 4 years old and have more than 100,000 miles. So it's not hard if a vehicle is well maintained, I think, to reach these numbers. And that's a good thing, as we'll see, because if you're trying to dispose of a vehicle that has not yet reached its useful life, it's a little harder.
Greg, we have a question.
Absolutely.
Okay. We are thinking of issuing a procurement for minivans for demand response service. How would or does the procurement documentation need to change since minivans are not TVMs?
Transit vehicle manufacturers, yeah. That is a smart question. So smart that I think I would have to do a little research. I can't give you a great answer now, unfortunately. But I do want to offer this. Hopefully, everyone knows my email address. Actually, it's at the end of this slide deck. So I really do mean this. If you have any questions for me, that pop into your head maybe next week or sometime in the future, I'll be happy to get an email from anyone. I really will. That's not an empty offer, and I'll try to get back to you. I can't promise that I'll get back to you like right away that day, but questions like this is the perfect thing. I need to do a little research, but I could probably get you a good answer. So if you're comfortable, I would encourage just send me a quick email, and I'll definitely get back to you.
Sounds good. There's no other questions right now.
Wonderful. Great. So we're still talking about disposing a vehicle that has reached the end of its useful life. So if a vehicle has a current fair market value of $5,000 or less, you kind of get that money. It doesn't like go into your pocket, but your organization can use that money to buy new vehicles. You don't have to reimburse FTA if it sells for $5,000 or less per unit. But as I was saying, if it goes for more than $5,000, that's when FTA wants to be reimbursed according to their original participation in the purchase price when it was new. So let's just kind of use an example. Say you sold a vehicle at auction, it reached the end of its useful life, it brings in $10,000. So your organization would keep the first $5,000. You don't have any obligation to reimburse FTA if it's $5,000 or less, remember. But this one went for $10,000. And if it was acquired with that standard FTA capital match rate of 80% federal funding, 20% local, FTA is then saying, all right, this is $10,000. That's $5,000 more than the $5,000 we let you keep. So we want 80% of that. So you would owe them $4,000. And I should say that it's changing a little, but in the past, it used to not be like you'd have to write FTA a check for $4,000. They would usually say, keep that money, use it towards your next vehicle purchase. But, I think these requirements are changing even in the past few months. And I am hearing that it'll look a little bit more like this going forward, where if you sell the vehicle for $10,000, you should be prepared to part ways for about with the $4,000 of that proceed. All right. So what if we're in a situation where we have to dispose of a vehicle before the end of its useful life? Well, you should know first off that whenever you do this, you have to ask for permission first. And that means permission from FTA, but really permission from ODOT, who may reach out to the FTA region. So that's the first step. Get permission to do it. They might ask for a justification because, again, it shouldn't be hard for a vehicle that's maintained to hit these useful life benchmarks. But, maybe typically FTA is like there probably isn't a great reason for you to have to get rid of this bus if it should have some life remaining. So in addition to getting permission, essentially, you have to also, if you have a request for early disposition, we'll call it, you have to have a rolling stock status report. I've got an example of the next slide. I think it comes again from that best practices procurement manual. And in this case, what you'll owe FTA in terms of their interest, I know these are kind of accounting terms, but we'll break it down in the next couple slides. FTA would be entitled to their share of the unamortized value of the remaining useful life per unit. But remember, useful life can be based on either miles or years. And actually, you can choose whichever is most advantageous to you. So if you would owe FTA less money by maybe counting the useful life as mileage versus years, you can do that. But you'll owe FTA the unamortized value of the remaining useful life per unit using straight line depreciation from the original purchase price. So hopefully that'll make a little bit more sense when we take a look at this rolling stock status report. Let's just take a look at the very last line here. And don't worry too much about the date, because if it really was a 1996 vehicle, it would of course be way past the end of its useful life. This is just from FTA's guidance, so it takes a while to get updated.
There's another quick question. Sorry.
No, let's do the question. Absolutely.
They want to know, is the value of vehicles based on the price paid by the purchaser or an accounting figure?
It's the price paid by the purchaser. So if it is sold at auction, the price, the highest bid at that auction is how you would establish the price. Yep. So basically what it sells for is your price. you're typically not looking up like the Kelly Blue Book value.
Okay, no other questions right this minute.
Great. Yeah, so let's look again at this last line here. So say you have a 40-foot bus. And remember, based on what we saw in that chart, that means its useful life is either 500,000 miles or 12 years. In this particular example, the vehicle is 10.9 years old, so it hasn't reached 12 years. And it has 450,000 miles, so it hasn't reached 500,000. Well, if we owe FTA kind of the remaining percent of the useful life based on miles, there's 10% of its useful life left based on the miles. But if we do it based on the years, we can see it's a little different. So the money that you would owe FTA based on years would actually be less, about $25,000, 26 in this example. But based on miles, it would be almost 30,000. So you're able to choose either miles or years based on whichever is more advantageous to you, which means, of course, whatever ends up in you owing the less amount. And this just kind of restates all that. So again, unamortized value of remaining useful life per unit, you can base that on miles or years, straight line depreciation. So again, we're not kind of like taking into effect, like if you buy a new car, you know how like the first year you own it, it loses a lot of its value and then it kind of levels off after that. So we're not taking that into account. This is just straight line depreciation. And then hopefully this will put a bow on it. I know it's a funny way to kind of word it, but if you have that vehicle, it's a big one, a 40-foot bus, 12 years, 500,000 mile minimum useful life, you can think of that value of the vehicle decreasing by about 1/12 every year, or it decreases by 1/500,000th for each mile driven. So that's why you can, you know, kind of calculate it based on whichever one will result in you owing the lesser amount.
Hey, Greg, this is Dave again.
Hi.
Hey, I just want to say that, you know, when we're talking about our rural systems, our grant subrecipients, you know, we have disposition criteria based on miles and years, okay? And when they go to auction with these vehicles, then what they get in that paid for price, then often we don't get a check back when that's often reinvested in the next vehicle. So, you know, you use an example of a large 40-foot bus is very rare on well, I don't think there's many of those on our rural systems. But,
sure.
Yeah, we're talking about light transit vehicles and accessible vans, those kinds of things. You know, we're really talking about, you know, our criteria and how that's reinvested in the program afterwards. So just wanted to add that. Thanks.
Yeah, understood. Great example. Yeah. So we used obviously a 40-foot bus, but that's just because I think the numbers are like significant enough so that it would really play out and how much would be owed back. It was just an example. And of course, we can, on that chart, we would probably be looking at, I think, mostly cutaways or even vans or service vehicles. And, you know, with the smaller vehicles, like I think the useful life should be very easy to reach because it's generally lower. So yeah, great point. And
Yeah.
in fact, let me then go back.
As you're going through this, Dave, if you could just, I noticed you dialed in too. If you could make sure to mute your phone too, that'd be great. Thanks. Thanks, Greg.
Great, yeah. So taking another look at this chart, yeah, we would probably almost certainly be in this category or even this category. So we probably, I mean, we don't have to do a quick poll, but based on what I know and what I've seen, it's not uncommon for like a body on chassis cutaway to be in service for far more than 5 years or 150,000 miles. So hopefully you can very easily reach these useful lives. All right, so here it is. We'll talk about common procurement findings. And I've got some data that actually comes from FTA that I'd like to share with you. But first, I just want to quickly talk about what a comprehensive review is. So basically, it means both these triennial and state management reviews. So like a direct recipient of 5307 monies from FTA, they would get a triennial. A state DOT would get a very similar type of review, but it's called a state management review. And you know, when you look at what used to be called the Comprehensive Review Guide, now it's called the Contractor's Manual. Remember, that was one of the resources that we talked about very early on today. That guide is for both these triennial and state managements. Like 85–90% of the questions are the same. There are just some bits that are applicable in triennials and not in state management and vice versa. But in general, when we say comprehensive reviews, we're kind of talking about the bucket of both triennials and state management. So these triennial reviews and state management reviews, they're actually mandated by Congress back in 1982. So this is a congressional mandate. That's why these things happen, rain or shine. We're doing these virtually this year, and we did them last year for FTA, just due to the ongoing health crisis. So we did actually pause a year. So this is very unusual. The recipients I'm reviewing now have a 4-year review period, not 3. So it's almost like a quadrennial review, but the plan is to get caught up and get back on that 3-year cycle ASAP. So you might say, well, I'm just a subrecipient of 5310 or 5311 money. We don't get any 5307. We're not a state DOT. Why are we worried about this type of review? As I mentioned earlier, and some of you might even have lived this, when ODOT gets its state management review, sometimes subrecipients are, I don't want to say caught up in that review, but if the reviewers want to see certain procurements that were done by subrecipients, remember ODOT stands in the shoes of their subrecipients in terms of compliance. So that's how you could kind of find yourself involved in maybe a state management review. And there are a lot of topics now. There are 23 now review areas in these reviews. The kind of larger font here I have in the left-hand column, these are, in my eyes, the big ones. Not that the ones on the right are not important, but these are the ones that you've probably heard of and frankly produce the most findings. So financial management, technical capacity, maintenance, ADA, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, procurement, hey, that's what we're talking about, DBE, disadvantaged business enterprise. But then there are other things like charter bus, school bus, some newer ones, transit asset management, a TAM plan. That's a requirement that is within the last few years. Same thing with PTASP, the Public Transit Agency Safety Plan. So just wanted to give you that context before we look at this. Now, this is a chart that I got from FTA. I know it's a little stale because it only goes up to 2018, but frankly, the 2019 reviews happened, 2020 no reviews happened, and the 2021 reviews are just really now closed out. And this data hasn't changed much. I really like the way it's presented here, so that's why it's a few years old. But this is not stale in the sense that the newer numbers look very much like this. So here we have the triennial review topic areas. And here we have the percentage of all findings that stem from these areas. So procurement, remember, is just one of 23 potential topics. In FY18, it produced about a quarter of all findings. And that number I've seen kind of fluctuate between maybe 20 and 25%, but it always stays there. So it's the #1 area, and that's why it's a good thing to know about, I think. Other big ones, though, are ADA, 16% of all findings, and then DBE, disadvantaged business enterprise, 13%. And then after that, there's a pretty steep drop off. Everything else is kind of in the single digits here. So keep that in mind. Procurement is a very ripe area, unfortunately, for producing findings in these FTA audits. This just says exactly what I did. And this has changed a little. They add new review areas every year. It used to be that contractor's manual I was talking about. I remember when it was like 400 pages. This year, the FY22 version is 650 pages. So in general, these reviews, I don't want to say get more bloated, but they rarely look at fewer things. It's like there are just more things being added every time. Here's another kind of, yep, go ahead.
This is Tim from ODOT, and I just wanted to mention that when we do our technical assistance reviews and we come in, one of the things that I noticed from 2021 reviews were a lot of places have procedures, but maybe they're not written. And so we're definitely looking for written policies and procedures. So when it comes to procurement or your financial policies in general, That's what we're really looking for. We come into a technical assistance review in the rural areas. So your 5311 entity, for example, make sure you have your policies written and documented in a way that we can review those and approve you.
Fantastic point. Absolutely. Yeah. So generally, if you are in one of these FTA reviews or audits, the reviewers, even if they like believe you and they want to give you credit, you know, their work typically is peer reviewed. So like the reviews I've done this year will go through a quality assurance process. So we need to kind of back up exactly why we did or did not give a finding. And we can only give recipients or subrecipients credit for what we have documented. So even if I'm convinced that procurements are being done perfectly, if there's no written procurement policies and procedures document, that's a problem. So absolutely. These things, like a key is these things just have to be written down. And we'll see that when we talk maybe more about what your procurement files should look like. You know, even if you did an ICE in the sense that you had that flash light bulb above your head saying, oh, the coffee should cost about $5, you have to write it down. Otherwise, it doesn't count. So great point. And I see that theme with a little variation over and over again. So yeah, documentation is absolutely key in these types of oversight situations. Yeah, great contribution. So taking a look at this chart. Now, this one actually lists the specific findings, not just the review areas that were kind of in the top 10 for that year. We can see procurement, the #1 finding overall was missing those FTA required contract clauses. 53 instances of that in FY18. And I think a reason why this is so tough, well, first of all, because it's always a popular finding. You can see everything in green here was a finding that was in the top 10 for at least at that point, the past 3 fiscal years. So with these perennial common findings, FTA reviewers are just trained to look for these things. Like if you don't have those FTA clauses, I would hope 99 or probably 100 out of 100 reviewers would catch that because it's a common issue there. When I get a solicitation, often I'll just, as a first step, I'll flip right to the end and be like, okay, it's got the clauses, and then I'll actually read it and go through. A couple other ones from procurement we see here that I know we've talked about. Look at this, lacking the cost or price analysis, also very common. Another one here, this wasn't, you know, in green, so it's not a perennial top finding, but pre-award and or post-delivery certifications lacking. So that's specific to rolling stock procurement. So if you didn't have that post-delivery Buy America certificate, that's what this finding means, 28 instances of that. And you know, we can see other common issues too. I think that's why this is a nice slide. Obviously, it's a comprehensive review because it's covering a lot of topics. As you know, finance, ADA, really all the civil rights topics are important and produce a lot of findings. So that's why I wanted to show you this. Missing FTA clauses is almost always the #1 finding. So that's why we talked about it at length here, and hopefully you'll take that away. So those were the common findings. And I want to kind of stress that they're low-hanging fruit to most reviewers, and that if there's a problem and it's one of those top 10 findings, any reviewer worth his or her salt will be able to spot that maybe from a mile away. So you're not going to just kind of skate by, hope the reviewer won't see it. But since we know what these issues are, there are, you know, pretty easy steps we can take to ensure that going forward, we do always have those FTA required contract clauses. So it's almost like if you work backwards from the common findings, I think that's a really good way to just begin your preparation in terms of making sure that you're in compliance with the requirements. All right, and that's the first deck I have. Remember, we're going to divide this session into 2 separate sessions. So it looks like we got maybe 15 minutes left. So we're out of slides, but not out of time. I'm happy to entertain additional questions, or perhaps, you know, I'll defer to ODOT on this. We can maybe take our break now and then resume at 12:45. So we'll still have that hour for lunch, and then we'll start our afternoon session maybe a little bit earlier. So whatever folks are comfortable with, I can be very flexible.
I'm not seeing any additional questions in the question box at this time. So Dave, would you like to go ahead and take lunch now? And then folks can be back on at 12:45?
Yeah, I think that'd be fine.
Okay.
I think that'd be fine.
All right. Well, what you can do is you can either just mute yourself, or I'm sorry, I guess you are already muted, guys. I apologize. You can just hang out, leave the window open, minimize it on your screen, and we're going to resume at 12:45. Or if you want to leave, you'll just have to click that same link to rejoin. And we do have a spreadsheet that tracks everybody who has joined and how attentive they were and what time you joined and what time you left and all that good stuff. So we'll know if you come back on. Also, I want to ask if anyone has shared their link with someone else, and I'm thinking that might be the case because I have a couple of folks who are showing up 2 or 3 times over in the attendees panel. This afternoon, I'm going to ask everybody to please put their name and email address in the question box when you return. So that way I know who was actually on here that might have not used a link that was originally sent to them. Maybe you used somebody else's link to get in, because I want to make sure that we have everybody properly recorded. So anyway, we've got an hour now, right, Greg?
Absolutely. So we'll see everyone at 12:45 sharp.
Great, thank you. And for those of you on the presenter side, I'm just going to mute and leave everything running. So I'll be back on probably about 12:40 just to make sure you guys are ready to roll. And Greg, you can just stop sharing your screen for now.
Okay, great. Good deal.
Thanks.
Thanks. See you all this afternoon.